Hi, I'm Liz Naumovski, host of Finance is Personal. When it comes to time, we can all agree that there's never enough of it. The reality is that women and men have exactly the same amount of time each day to achieve the same goals. Now, women continue to enter professional and corporate jobs at the same rate as men, and many of these career choices result in long work hours. Now, when you factor in a culture of long work hours, why is it that women are often perceived as having less of a grasp on managing and coping with time demands? Most women are pros at juggling family and career, but when the subject of time comes into play, why is it that women are put under a microscope? And why do our male counterparts forego the scrutiny that women are subjected to when it comes to time management? A recent study, Women, Men, and the Time Control Gap, brings to light the gender perceptions and bias that exists in corporate and professional workplaces around the subject of time. Joining me today to talk about her research is Dr. Erin Reid, Associate Professor of HR and Management at the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
So I found your whole research fascinating, and you called it AGM Company.
Yes, so that's a fake name.
Fake name. Mm-hmm. However, what you did was you picked one Canadian company that was global, and that's how you decided to choose or do your research through.
So it was, so I studied a global management consulting firm. I studied 4 offices of the company. One of them was the Toronto office, and then there were 3 US offices.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So you looked at the study. Why study the experience of men in places of long hours? Well, why was this fascinating to you?
Yeah, so I was at the time doing my PhD, and I was very interested in and puzzled by why we still have gender inequality. So when you look at people in professional workplaces, corporations, firms, they hire men and women at pretty much the exact same rate. So accounting firms, consulting firms, law firms will hire 50% women. But when you look at the partner level, there's typically at the max 20% women. So I was really curious about why we have this big fall off. And there's tons of studies of women, and at that time there was almost nothing on men. So I decided to study men.
So how did you choose that company? Because it couldn't have been easy to get access to all of these people and the information.
Yeah, so I was lucky. I was studying at Harvard Business School, which has lots of connections with big corporations. And this one came to my dissertation advisor and said, we have a problem with women. We can't keep women. Could you help us understand our problem with women? And she said, sure. I have this doctoral student who wants to study men. Would you let her in? And they said, sure. I mean, that's cute, and that'll make the men feel better, right? That was kind of like the feeling. They were very kind to let me in.
Right. Mm-hmm. So now, what did you find initially? How did you break into it, and how did you broach all the questions that when you spoke to all the men?
Mm-hmm. So they were very kind. They gave me access to 100 men. I think I ended up interviewing something like close to 80 of the men who worked there at these different offices, and I just started interviewing them about their sort of work and family lives, the kinds of things that we always ask women about, but we very rarely ask men about. And what I very quickly found was that even though the company thought that women at the company had a problem with its time demands, men had huge problems as well.
Okay, so that must have been really surprising to you, because most people think it's the women that have problems with the long hours.
For sure. And that's the dominant narrative. It was the narrative there. But these men who I was interviewing, so it's a consulting firm, they were expected to travel at the last minute, work these very long hours, often work on the weekends. They reported working typically 60, some up to 80 hours a week even. And they talked a lot about the drain on their personal lives, like how hard it was on their marriages, how they never went to the doctor, they didn't see their kids, or they didn't think they could have kids because they couldn't see them. All these things that we tend to hear women saying, I was hearing these men say as well.
That's really interesting, because that's such a misnomer. Everybody thinks it's the women who run home to their children, and they're the ones that want to stay at home with their children, and the men just want to go out and make money. But nobody thinks about the fact that these guys actually want to go and watch their children play baseball or soccer and just actually spend some quality time with their family.
Absolutely. And even the single men, they would talk about how they they couldn't date properly because they would like meet someone and they would go on a few dates and then they would be assigned to a project on the other side of the country. Or this person who they met didn't understand why they had to work all weekend. Or, they felt like their health was not in a great place and they wanted to exercise or join a sports team and they could not commit to making practices. So it really impacted all parts of their lives. And I don't want to say also, I don't want to say that men have it worse than women, or I don't really have any statements to make about equality between the two. Like women definitely have a hard time, but I think that what I found in this study was that men were having a really hard time too, and it was totally unacknowledged.
And that's just it. A lot of people don't realize there's a huge cost to working really long hours and working weekends and being on call 24/7.
Absolutely, it's just draining. And I think for these people, they were all very ambitious. They had gone to great sort of universities. A lot of them had MBAs, and so you sort of finish school, and you want to do something like great. And these companies are awesome, right? You can travel a lot, and they'll pay you lots of money. It's really cool, high status. But they found after 3 or 4 years, it really drained.
So it's a drain on us as human beings. But what's the drain on organizations?
So what I found was I didn't think these people were actually being any more productive in the last 20 hours they put in than they were in the first sort of 45 or 50 hours. And they would tell me that they were often working the longer hours. They would say the extra 20% is just to prove that we're working hard, just to show the partner we're working hard, or just to show the client we're responsive. They would talk about preparing 100-page decks or 100-slide decks that had like way too much information in it, but it was just to demonstrate that they were working hard. So there was a lot about demonstrating something that didn't necessarily correspond to the actual quality of what they were doing. So there was just a lot of waste.
You know what, that's really interesting because you were talking about them, doing 100-page decks. Well, there's a lot of people out there that only want, totally. It's 3 pages when you're doing a presentation. You don't need 100 pages.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so they wouldn't necessarily present the whole thing. They would present a short part and hand over the 100 pages.
What a waste of time, energy, and quality. Dr. Erin Reid and I will be back after the break to talk more about her research, women, men, and the time control gap here on Finance is Personal. Welcome back to Finance is Personal. I'm Liz Naumovski, and we're here today with Dr. Erin Reid, Associate Professor of HR and Management at the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University. So let's go back to, everybody keeps thinking that women, it's mostly a women's problem when they have to work long hours, but it isn't. Can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, so we have these societal assumptions that the person who takes care of the home and the family and takes care of the kids is a woman, and so we assume in these really demanding workplaces that it's women who are going to have work-family problems or trouble with the long hours, and that came out in a bunch of different ways in my study. So I had men saying, if I work with a man, I don't really worry too much about like what I demand of him. But if I work with a woman, I worry about it because I know she's got kids at home. So she needs to be available for her kids. So there was that. I also, I talked to a woman who was, I think she was almost 50 at that point. And she said people were very concerned that she hadn't had children, and they still talked about like, when you have a family, when you have children. And she had been, very clear that this was a choice she had made, but people just assumed that she was going to take on this sort of role outside. I also found when people talked about role models in the firm, they had a really hard time identifying female role models. So there weren't very many female senior partners at the firm.
Or mentors.
Or mentors, right, like in terms of numbers. And they would talk about, some of them did not have families and some of them did have families. And the ones who did not have families were portrayed as cold and bitches.
Of course.
Yes, and the ones who did have families, they would talk about what terrible mothers they were.
I wonder if a lot of this has to do with the old leave it to Beaver TV shows where dad went to work, mom stayed at home. She had to wear her pearls. She had to look beautiful for him to come home, and she had her, the drink waiting for him at the door. I wonder if a lot of people still have that stigma in the back of their head, and this is why they make these assumptions.
Totally. And there's this really interesting book by a feminist historian, Stephanie Kuntz. She looks at the history of families in North America. And in that book, she writes about how we always assume that, in the good old days, dad worked and mom stayed home with the kids. But when you actually look at the data, that was only ever about 30% of families. In nearly all families, women worked in some capacity.
Of course.
So it's a stereotype that we have, but it's just a stereotype. It never explained.
It's a skewed stereotype, though.
Yeah, it never explained everyone anyway.
Right. And it's interesting, I was reading your research report, and you talked about the fact that the men actually did this team approach where they all covered for each other, and that the women were all on their own, not bringing their work up to par, not putting in all the hours that they thought that their male counterparts were doing.
Yeah, so there were so in this firm they would hire, I think, about 40% women at the entry level, and then men and women actually turned over at the same rate. So they left the firm, about 20% of women, about 20% of men left the firm every year. But the firm only ever hired men into senior positions. They would never hire a woman into a senior position. So the effect is that at the top, you don't have very many women. So the women, it seemed like they felt alone, right? So they're in this firm. People respect them, they think they're competent, but they were also always encountering assumptions about their family lives or their desire for family lives, presumed by other people.
Right.
Whereas for the men, it was a male-dominated firm. It was easy for them to find friends. It was easy for them to feel that they fit in. And so the men would develop these really sort of close relationships, and then they would feel like they could cover for each other or they could ask for favors, and it wasn't a big deal. So for one example, I interviewed this guy. He had 2 little kids at home, and I asked him, how do you manage your time? And he said, I always work with the same manager. He has a similar family life. He doesn't really ask me to work on the weekends. I can tell him if something comes up. And so they were able to sort of do like an informal workaround that allowed him to manage his work and family life, so he didn't have to work too much. Women, though, if they wanted to not work as much or if they wanted to not work on the weekend, it just seemed like a much bigger deal. They felt they did not have these easy relationships. They felt like it was a big deal to ask for it. They were often encouraged to take part-time arrangements or these really sort of formal things that obviously came with lower salary, sort of less advancement, all that kind of stuff.
That always seems to be the key, right? You can work part-time, we'll pay you less.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about your research at a dinner party. Mm-hmm. I was telling people that, I had heard you speak and I was really impressed with the research. And we were talking about, the dichotomy between men and women and long hours. And one of the guys had said, well, I wonder whether the men teamed up together because of team sports. Because in the olden days, and when I was growing up, there weren't that many female team sports, right? Mm-hmm. So we would do gymnastics or we would do skating or something that you were kind of the lone wolf, but men have always grown up with team sports. And so we had this discussion about the fact that, that might be one of the reasons why it seems to work in the boardroom.
I think that's absolutely true. And you're reminding me of this book I read that it's called Hardball. Uh-huh. It's advice for women in corporate America or corporate North America. And it's based around, it's been a bestseller since the mid 80s. It's a great book. And it's based around this idea that, men, part of the rules of corporate America are from the sports field, and women did not play on the sports field, so they don't get it, right? It's like they're in a different culture, for many of them, anyway. It's a great book, Hardball. Yeah. But I think you're right. So I think it's 2 things. I think, yes, boys and girls are socialized very differently. They do have different kinds of sports. I think that's changing a little bit now. So there's that. And then when you also get into a situation where you are a minority, and there aren't many other people like you, it can be hard to find those easy relationships that help you navigate a difficult workplace.
And I think the problem too is, like, when you're in a team environment, it's easier to inflate your work hours, and it's easier to have somebody else work for you so that you can take off and do whatever you need to do for your family. But the women didn't have that.
Right. So I have two examples for you.
Okay, wait, hold on to those examples, because we have to go to break. We'll be right back after this break to learn more about the corporate and professional leaders, what they can do to create a level playing field for women here on Finances Personal. Welcome back to Finances Personal. I'm Liz Naumovski. Joining me today is Dr. Erin Reid, Associate Professor of HR and Management at the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University. So before we went to break, we were talking about the team approach and the team analogy, and you said that you have two examples.
Yes. So I interviewed this team. I interviewed, I think there were about eight people on the team, and I interviewed, I think, seven of them, most of them, right? And I found, this was towards the end of my study, and I had been interviewing many people who said they had to work 60 to 80-hour weeks, just to keep up and get promoted. And I realized on this team, most people are working 40, 45 hours. They're like super relaxed. They're not nearly as stressed as everyone else I've been talking to. And so eventually I interviewed the senior partner who runs the team, and I said, like, what's going on? Everyone who works for you doesn't work so much, and you're a senior partner and you're also only working 45 hours.
And you're loving it.
And you're loving it, you're happy, like, what's going on? He said, well, our business is good. We work together to make sure that everyone has a sane life, and we're selling enough to our customers that no one's really asking us questions. They were kind of like a closed off unit within the firm.
Right.
And they were mostly men, again. So that's what happens in the teams, and it contrasted very much to the experience of other people who were kind of like bouncing between different teams or working for lots of different people and always working on the weekends and, kind of miserable.
Stressed out, yeah.
Totally different. So men were more likely to have to be on these kinds of teams, or to have at least a relationship with a manager that was, kind of thoughtful and would allow them to work, not so much. Women tended to be pushed into formal kind of part-time arrangements in order to manage their time. And
so they could go home and take care of their children.
Exactly. So on the same day, I interviewed a man and a woman at about the same level, kind of like a senior manager-ish level, early 40s. And they both told me they were working about 50 hours a week, and I would have them describe, a work week. So like, when did you go to work on Monday? How long did you work? Do you work much on the weekend? So I had like that level of detail. And so they're both working about 50 hours a week, but the woman is on an 80% schedule.
See,
and the man is full time.
And listening to this, it is so unfair. Mm-hmm. And so what can women do now? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. If we're all working the same amount of hours and putting in the same passion and blood, sweat, and tears, mm-hmm. The dichotomy between working, being paid 100% and 80% is hurtful, and it's huge. And it's hurtful to women for retirement purposes as well, because Absolutely. We're making less money but working the same amount. So what words of wisdom do you have for women that would help them go forward?
So I think one thing is, don't explain so much where you're going and when. I think
sometimes silence is golden, and not being as transparent is helpful.
Exactly. If you need to leave early to pick your kid up from school, don't tell anyone that's why you're leaving. Pretend it's for a client. You don't have to come right out and lie, although many of the men were actually lying about where they were. But don't be too honest or too transparent, because it will bring all these biases to life, and they'll kind of be around you. So silence is golden.
Silence is golden.
As I go on.
Because I wanted to talk about as well, I read in the report, there was a guy who went skiing with his son for 5 days in a row. Mm-hmm. And yet he was like the golden child, and he was the guy who was the up and rising star.
Totally, yeah. So he told me, I talked to him from the I think he was at the McDonald's. I would talk to him. He was at the McDonald's on the way to the ski hill,
right,
or on the way back from the ski hill. And he told me he had skied with his son, who was about 4, every morning all week, and then he'd spent the afternoon taking calls and getting his work done. So he was still working.
Mm-hmm.
But I said, do your colleagues know you're at the ski resort? And he was like, no, and they don't need to know. I'm getting my work done. And he was absolutely right.
And that actually now tells us that silence is golden.
Absolutely.
Because at times we tell too many people what we're up to and what's going on. And I think that's just who we are and how we speak.
Mm-hmm.
But being quiet about what you do and having the illusion of working actually works better for you.
Definitely.
Now, because you're in HR, and I know a lot of women struggle,
mm-hmm.
do you have any words of wisdom that can help women when they're struggling at work and struggling with hours and actually struggling with the family and trying to be a big provider as well? Because there's a lot of women out there that are single and have more struggles than others.
So I would say I think women have often more latitude or more power than they realize. I think we're socialized to ask permission, we're socialized to please other people, but I would say it's okay to say no. It's okay to tell a client you can't work over the weekend. It's okay if you need to leave work to just leave work, and maybe it's going to catch up with you, but it might be worth experimenting with. Just saying no and setting more boundaries, and after 6 months seeing what happens. Is there any backlash at all? There might not be.
What about if they know that one of their colleagues is making more money than them? We as women are always apprehensive in going into management to talk about getting a raise.
Mm-hmm.
And we're always, no, I don't think I'm going to go now, or we're always afraid, and we're always, we've got that negative aspect in our head and we talk ourselves down. What can you say to women who actually think, I really do need a raise, I haven't had one in a long time? Do you have any tips that can be helpful to them?
I think they should ask for the raise, period, because I think if you don't ask for a raise, you're not going to get one. And there's a lot of research on negotiations in women, mm-hmm. and salary negotiations in women, and one thing that seems to be true is that women do a little bit better if they can say that a mentor suggested they do this.
Okay.
So if you're nervous about asking your boss for a raise, it might be helpful to speak to another senior mentor, get their backup, and then you can say, Joe thought it was time for me to ask, right? And then it seems, the research suggests that this makes it's validation, it makes it a little bit more legitimate. It's not just you anymore, it's also this person who may be a peer of the person you're talking to. So that's one strategy, but I think in general, women just need to ask.
Just do it.
Yeah.
Okay, and quickly, solutions are not individual. So what can leaders do? 1 or 2 things.
So a big thing is leaders need to set very clear boundaries for their employees. So often managers and leaders are very well-meaning and they say, well, I'll let my employees set their own boundaries and I will respect their boundaries. That may be true, but your employees are anxious. They want the raise, they want the promotion, and so they are unlikely to actually set their own boundaries. So it's up to the leader and the manager to set rules around when emails are sent. When do we expect emails to be responded to? That kind of stuff.
Great, thank you so much. Now, time doesn't have to be the enemy that prevents women from getting it all done and getting ahead. The reality is that gender inequality is prevalent in corporate and professional workplaces. It's important for leaders in every sector to recognize that gender inequality exists and to create an equal playing field for women and men. Ladies, it's time to change our story. I'd like to thank Dr. Erin Reid for joining me today and you, our viewers, for watching. For more information about the show and to view past episodes, please go to financespersonal.ca. I'm Liz Naumovski. Bye for now.